Through the streets of Selma, the pupils marched under heavy police guard, issued a statement saying they were demonstrating because their parents have been denied the right to vote. In Dallas County, although Negroes outnumber whites, several thousand whites are registered, only a few hundred Negroes. The teenagers were protesting voter registration procedures under which the Board of Registrars is open just 2 days a month, except under special circumstances. Through it all today, Martin Luther King spent his third day in Selma's city jail. There are no indications when he'll post bond to get out. Charles Quinn, NBC News, Montgomery.
Welcome to Better to Speak, the podcast, where we use storytelling to transform silence into language and action. I'm your host, Kési Felton. On today's episode, we're going to discuss all things voting, but first I wanted to wait until Super Tuesday to see how that went. And today, this is Wednesday, I'm recording this, or Thursday, my candidate, Elizabeth Warren, actually dropped out. And it was interesting because I just got my absentee ballot to vote back home in Georgia. Cast my ballot for her, and I had this ballot in my purse for the past couple of days, just waiting to see what would happen. And of course, today she dropped out. And so that kind of made me start thinking about, well, should I even send my absentee ballot off? And I think that for me, just seeing how crowded this campaign started out, it was really important for me to just cast my own ballot, because this whole thing has been kind of difficult to choose a candidate in the first place. And I think Elizabeth Warren was one of the candidates that really stood out to me, that I really believed in, that I was really excited about, not necessarily because of her. And I don't really want to get into, like what I was talking about last episode, this idea of, waiting for a savior in terms of electoral politics. But I did believe in her. I did believe in her campaign, her messaging, and more importantly, the Black women that she had around her and supporting her. And so for me, it was more about that and not necessarily about choosing the right candidate, choosing the candidate that, everybody on the TL is talking about or that they approve of. And so, again, I went ahead and cast that ballot. And then it made me think about this larger conversation of how do we navigate, especially for young people, navigating those conversations about, young people not turning out to vote, but understanding that, we're grounded in this idea that this system of electoral politics isn't one that I really believe in 100%, but I understand that not voting and not participating isn't really an option. It's not the most effective alternative. For me, again, it was good that I found a candidate that I believed in and supported, which is why I still mailed off my ballot. But I think I will end up supporting Bernie Sanders, probably because he is the most similar in terms of policies. I was a Bernie supporter in 2016 when I first turned 18. And it wasn't, that I don't agree with his policies now, but he just doesn't really excite me as a candidate. But again, I probably will end up supporting him just because, again, the alternative of Joe Biden isn't really that much better. So it just, again, reminds me that the electoral politics shouldn't be our only means of participating. I mean, it shouldn't be the only or most valued way of making your voice heard. But especially, again, for Black folks, we have to remember that we've come so far in terms of our ability to vote. And that's what I wanted to get into in this episode, was just talking about how does that, understanding our history to better understand our present, kind of frame how young Black people specifically will approach the 2020 election. So, of course, I'm thinking of the anniversary of Selma, Alabama, Bloody Sunday, and just how far, like I said, how far we've come in terms of our ability to get the right to vote, the right that we've deserved. And in that, making that link from then to now, I don't think that society paints a clear enough picture for what motivations or what benefits that we get from voting. I think the conversation is always, you have to get out and vote. Like I saw some celebrity had a t-shirt that said vote or die. And it was like, of course it is that drastic at the end of the day, but I think it's not just, it shouldn't be painted as such an alarmist thing. We should have more creative, innovative ways of making it clear as to why voting is so important. And it's interesting that, it took Donald Trump for us to be so motivated to vote, but my fear is that we won't have a long-term game plan for what civic engagement will look like, or what the strategy to mobilize voters will look like past January 21st, 2021. And so going back to the overall dialogue about voting, especially for young people, is the very patronizing and at times condescending tone that I feel like older generations take with us over exercising our right to vote. And I'm sure you've heard the expression within the Black community of it took, if you know what our ancestors did in order for us to get that right, you wouldn't be, as apathetic as a lot of young people are, or just unwilling to vote. And I think when you do take the time to go back to that timeline of Black voting from the Black codes, the Dred Scott decision, all the way up until Stacey Abrams' gubernatorial race, I often feel that, again, instead of educating young people and getting us energized, we see the finger pointed at us for, disappointing turnout rates. And so I think back to the whole, when the Popeye's chicken sandwich first dropped, and there were people in line literally outside of the building for the sandwich, and people were throwing shade, talking about, oh, we should have this energy when it comes to voting. And I think that there's a difference between that and, being the person that actually goes out and registers people to vote and takes that same energy off of the TL and changes it into actually trying to mobilize and get people, registered to vote and making sure that they have the resources to make an informed decision. And so people made a good point of highlighting that comments like that, although they may be well-intentioned, kind of erase the role of ongoing voter suppression, like what we saw on Super Tuesday with people having to wait for hours in these super long lines to vote, a general lack of civic education, making sure that people know where to vote, how to register to vote, how to register for their absentee ballots, things like that, just knowing what policy measures are going to be on the ballot. Different factors that make it hard for people to vote. And so I think of, that Tyra Banks meme where it's like, stress the importance of voting without the condescension. And then we also don't hold space, like I was talking about earlier, for the idea that certain candidates and policies just aren't enough and they don't meet the needs of everyone within the Black community. And so it's hard to navigate that because you don't want to settle. I know a lot of people are like, well, the system is flawed, the system is rigged, but you obviously don't want to be a part of the group who just doesn't choose to vote. And I think for this next part, I want to address those people. For those of us who kind of willingly ignore our responsibility to vote, whether because, again, you think your vote doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things, or because you think the system is flawed, I truly believe that voting and showing up to make your contribution in the shaping of society is important, and that everyone should try their hardest to do it. And again, for me, it's not about how my vote will affect 330 million people, but it's the principle of me knowing that I showed up for, my community and my community's interest. And so that's what, this whole situation with my absentee ballot showed me, is that I easily could have just kept my ballot or sent it back and got another one and made the vote for another person. But I think that self-silencing, or like me shifting, what I believed in or who I believed in simply because the system didn't work, I just didn't really sit well with me. And so another reason why, it's difficult navigating this whole topic of voting is because a lot of us feel like the system is a lot bigger than us, that our contributions won't make a difference. But I think that we should redirect that conversation as well as our efforts to ensure that we're showing up for ourselves, like I said, our families, our communities, and those within our society that are most vulnerable. And so that can be, I think of this idea of like just within our corner of the world. So like your neighborhood, your city, your friend group, depending on your breadth of impact and the reach that you could have, just doing the work to ensure that as many of those people you can reach have that seed of hope or interest in doing their part planted within them. That has a lot more of an exponential effect than I think that we give ourselves credit for. And so when I hear people talking more broadly about political power, specifically for Black people, they're usually implying that that power goes beyond voting. And I think that's also something that's not as stressed. So step one is showing up to the polls and voting and getting your community to do the same. And after that, I think comes the realization that we have a lot more of a say and a lot more power than we allow ourselves to believe. And so whether you exercise that within the confines of electoral politics or elsewhere in your community, that power definitely exists. But of course, the prerequisite is that you show up for step one. And so going back to what I was talking about earlier, if it's an issue of candidates not being the best representative of your community, or, your community's interests or policy measures not matching up, then that conversation needs to be had and stressed. And so another thing is that I feel like we are told to settle a lot for different candidates, and waiting for a savior to come up, waiting for that perfect candidate, instead of really investing into leadership within our own community and making sure that the people who are coming up have those tools and those resources, and that, we're making our voices heard and our concerns heard. And so that we're at the table in the development of these candidates' platforms and not waiting just to see what it is and then seeing if it measures up. That's one of the reasons why I really like Warren, is because there's an organization called Black Women For who endorsed her, and they were really, really imperative in not just, putting her name on their website and their platform and making t-shirts, but they were really, really, really pressed her to be held accountable to making sure that she's actually, about the things that she had in her platform. And so they always talked about, or the women that were a part of that group were always talking about how they were constantly checking her on different policies, and not just policies pertaining to the Black community, but just across her platform. So I think that shows that leadership, and that's what I liked about Warren's campaign, is that leadership can be held accountable for their platforms and for their responsibility as an elected official. They can be held accountable for their just thoroughly examined as a leader and what they're hoping to bring to our communities. And so again, touching on that savior complex, either with our leadership or just our systems in general, like that's, I feel like, is what gets us caught up and jaded over long periods of time. It's just the idea that it consistently doesn't work. I think looking from, again, where we started in terms of the Democratic pool to now, it's like long term, it just kind of reflects the same things that we've been seeing. And so I think aside from the fact that for Black people and other marginalized groups in this country, the system wasn't set up for us to win. But I've realized throughout, my learnings in sociology and politics that the systems that we've, as a society, have decided to organize ourselves and define ourselves with were made by flawed human beings, were made by, human beings who are actively trying to harm other groups. And so that's why we have the certain dynamics that we have. And so because those systems still exist, because the attitudes and beliefs that uphold them still exist, I don't really think that we're going to see that long-term change or transformation that I think Warren was fighting for, or getting at, and that we're ultimately hoping for. And so a lot of us in this generation just kind of feel like, well, this is just how the system is. I don't really have the power to change it. And that kind of creates this sense of apathy where, we have people who don't want to vote because they don't see the system working for them. And it's, you have to acknowledge that you can't really blame them. And it's definitely well deserved, I guess, towards the system. And so what I say to that, again, is that in order to combat it, in order to try and find solutions for the problem and not just accepting that and staying in the sense of apathy, is like we have to recognize our power, not just politically, but personally. I mean, that's what Better to Speak's whole platform is about, is that before any of the social justice or political stuff, you really have to first believe that your voice inherently belongs in those conversations and in the shaping of society, and that you have something to offer through your unique way of showing up in the world, and that you can't be complicit and sit by while other people have a hand in shaping your reality for you. And so, again, I don't think that stops at this one election, nor does it stop at voting. The institutional change and transformation that I think people are fighting for and that they have been fighting for, again, won't come overnight, and definitely has to start with the unlearning of, these harmful systems and beliefs and just the other functions of white supremacy that have been built up literally for centuries. Like, they're not just going to come down overnight. And so I think, again, we have to place a greater value on learning and unlearning and becoming more active members of, whatever communities we find ourselves in, and our voices and our power. And so I think that unless we do that, these institutions will last, and we'll see the same iterations of the issues that we're fighting up against now and generation after generation. And so ultimately, I don't want to, be that person that harps like you have to vote, you have to vote, you have to vote. But, at this point in our political climate, your silence will not protect you. And imagining that we live in a world where voter suppression doesn't exist, people choosing not to vote is being complicit at the end of the day. And so I personally just think that it undermines a lot of the work that these organizations, that these activists are doing to make sure that we have the right to vote, making sure that, we're dismantling these harmful systems that clearly are not working for us. And it doesn't require that you be an activist per se, but it can be as simple, again, as you having conversations with your friends and your families, even though that may be difficult, but like the people that you choose to be in community with, and having those conversations and ensuring that everybody is doing their part, and making, your plans to vote, making sure that, you have the correct polling addresses, that people are registered, getting their absentee ballots, just talking over important local ballot measures and platforms of your candidate, and not just, for the presidential election at the top of the ticket, but for local officials as well. And so other ways you can get involved with local organizations and register people to vote, or check their voter registration or get their absentee ballot. Just find whatever works for you, even if it's one time, or you find something that you commit to for the election cycle or even further. Just try your best to do your part, because it is important. So that's it for this episode. This has been your 20-minute PSA on voting, brought to you by Better to Speak. You can find us on social media at bettertospeak_, or at our website, bettertospeak.org. Make sure to tune in to future episodes where we'll dive into various socio-political topics with the goal of transforming silence into language and action. Again, this has been your host, Kési Felton. Thank you for listening.